Weilheim, Bavaria. The 1st of May, 1945. Rain has been falling on the Alpine foothills for most of the morning, turning the roads to gray ribbons of mud, and in a requisitioned farmhouse, a tired old man sits at a wooden table with his hands folded in front of him. He is 69 years old. His uniform is unbuttoned at the collar. His boots are caked in dirt from 3 days on the run, and the two aides beside him have not spoken in an hour. Outside, American soldiers of the 36th Infantry Division stand smoking in the doorway, glancing in every so often at the man they have just taken prisoner. He does not look like much, but the intelligence officers already know his name, and within days it will travel through every Allied headquarters in Europe. Gerd von Rundstedt, General Feldmarschall, the most senior officer left in the entire German army, has been captured. Word of the arrest does not stay contained for long. It reaches the headquarters of the American Third Army, commanded by a man whose reputation for theater rivaled his reputation for ferocity, George S. Patton. And what happens next, according to the story that has circulated in regimental messes, memoirs, and documentary voiceovers for 80 years, is this. When the two men finally stood face to face, Patton did not gloat. He did not humiliate a beaten enemy for the cameras. He raised his hand and saluted him. The two men made an unlikely pair of protagonists. Patton was 59 that spring, restless, ambitious, and increasingly frustrated at being kept away from Berlin by decisions made above his head. Rundstedt was a decade older, a man who had already retired once from military life in 1938 out of disgust at the direction the Nazi state was taking, only to be recalled to the colors within a year and handed command of one army group after another for the rest of the war. Where Patton courted publicity with pearl-handled pistols and speeches designed to be quoted, Rundstedt cultivated the opposite reputation, that of the quiet, old-fashioned Prussian staff officer who rarely even bothered to wear the uniform his rank entitled him to, preferring the simpler tunic of the infantry regiment he had once commanded. It is precisely because the two men were built from such different material that the story of a meeting between them, framed around a single gesture of mutual recognition, has carried such weight in the retelling. It is one of the most repeated anecdotes of the closing days of the war in Europe, and it is worth being honest from the outset about what can and cannot be proven. The precise moment of a Patton salute to Rundstedt does not appear in an official after-action report, stamped, dated, and signed by a witnessing officer. What survives instead is a scattering of secondary accounts, oral histories from men who covered the surrenders and the war crimes trials that followed, and the testimony of German commanders themselves about how Patton conducted himself towards defeated professional soldiers. Whether or not that exact gesture happened exactly as legend has it, the story endures for a reason, and that reason says something genuine about the strange formal code of respect that still bound enemy generals together, even as the war around them had become anything but formal. This is the story of why that code existed, who these two men were, and why the idea of an American saluting a Nazi field marshal has refused to fade from memory. To understand why such a moment mattered, it helps to understand exactly what the Allies were dealing with in the spring of 1945. By this point, the war had stopped resembling the campaigns of 1940. It had become something closer to a manhunt on a continental scale. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were surrendering daily, entire armies dissolving into columns of exhausted men walking west rather than east, desperate to be captured by Americans or Britons rather than fall into Soviet hands. Amid all of that chaos, distinguishing a genuine war criminal from a professional officer who had simply worn the wrong uniform for 6 years was an enormous and urgent problem. Intelligence officers were interrogating dozens of senior commanders a week, trying to work out who among them had merely followed orders in the conventional military sense and who had actively enabled the atrocities that Allied soldiers were now discovering as they advanced, most horrifically at places like Dachau, which troops had liberated only days earlier. The scale of that sorting problem is easy to understate from a distance of 80 years. Allied intelligence organizations were, within the space of a few weeks, attempting to process the surrender of an entire national army, one that had numbered well over 10 million men at its peak, while simultaneously trying to establish which of its senior officers bore genuine responsibility for atrocities that stretched from the killing fields of the Eastern Front to the death camps now being uncovered across occupied Europe. There was no existing framework for a task of that size. Interrogation centers were being improvised in farmhouses, requisitioned hotels, and country estates across southern Germany, staffed by officers who often had only days to decide whether the man in front of them was a war criminal, a reluctant conscript of circumstance, or something uncomfortably in between. Rundstedt presented a particularly awkward case for that sorting process. He was not a Nazi Party member. He had opposed aspects of Hitler's strategy on more than one occasion, most famously advising that the Western Front could not be held and that peace negotiations were the only sensible course, a recommendation that got him sacked by Hitler for the second time in March 1945. Yet he had also lent his name and his authority to orders that facilitated terrible crimes on the Eastern Front, including directives permitting the summary execution of captured Soviet political commissars. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of figure the Allies found hardest to categorize. Not innocent, but not obviously monstrous either. A career soldier from a Prussian military dynasty stretching back generations who had simply kept serving the state, whatever that state demanded of him. Patton, for his part, had spent nearly the entire war forming opinions about the men on the other side of the line. He read German military writing obsessively between the wars, including work by Erwin Rommel, and he watched the opening campaigns of the Second World War with the professional fascination of a fellow tank officer studying a rival's technique. By 1945, he had built, in his own mind, a kind of private league table of enemy commanders, ranking them by skill, boldness, and the seriousness with which they had fought him. Rundstedt, who had commanded the German forces opposing him in the West and who had a reputation as one of the last old-school Prussian officers of the General Staff tradition, sat near the top of that table. Patton did not extend that respect to everyone in a German uniform. Members of the SS, whom he regarded as ideological fanatics rather than soldiers, received no such courtesy. And there are far better documented accounts of Patton dealing brusquely and coldly with SS officers who expected the ordinary protections of rank. Rundstedt's career reads almost like a case study in the compromises that senior German officers made with the Nazi state. He entered the Prussian army as a teenager in the 1890s, decades before Hitler had even entered politics. And by the time the Second World War began, he had already spent over 40 years in uniform. He commanded Army Group South in the invasion of Poland, oversaw Army Group A during the Lightning Campaign through France in 1940, and was the man who requested the controversial halt order outside Dunkirk that allowed hundreds of thousands of British and French troops to be evacuated rather than destroyed. He went on to command in the East during the invasion of the Soviet Union, was dismissed after clashing with Hitler over strategy near Rostov, was recalled again as commander-in-chief in the West in time to oversee the defenses facing the Normandy landings, and was dismissed and recalled a further 2 times before the war ended, each dismissal a small measure of how uneasy his relationship with Hitler's high command had become. By his own later account, and by the testimony of officers who served alongside him, Rundstedt increasingly saw the war in its final years as unwinnable, and he said so plainly enough to be sacked for it, telling the German high command bluntly, when asked what should be done as the Allies broke out of Normandy, that they should make peace. This is really where the heart of the story lies, not in a single gesture, but in a distinction Patton drew constantly throughout 1944 and 1945, between the profession of arms as he understood it and the ideology that had hijacked it. He had grown up steeped in an almost antiquated idea of soldiering, one that traced its lineage back through Napoleon and Frederick the Great, in which honorable enemies who fought skillfully and by the accepted rules of war deserved to be treated with a measure of dignity even in defeat, however uncomfortable that idea sits with a modern audience who rightly judges the Wehrmacht by the regime it served. Patton's own diaries and letters are full of this old-fashioned martial romanticism. He spoke of war in terms of honor, contest, and craft, and he seemed to genuinely believe that a professional soldier like Rundstedt, however tainted by association with the Nazi state, belonged to a different category from the men who had run the camps. What makes the encounter, real or embellished, so compelling is the contrast it creates. Roughly 2 weeks after Rundstedt's capture, correspondent Bill Jarnigan, who had covered the fighting from the Battle of the Bulge onward, was assigned to interview the old field marshal directly. His account, preserved in an oral history archive, describes Rundstedt as unmistakably a professional soldier of the old school, a man who held himself apart from the fanaticism of the younger SS officers around him and who spoke of the fighting in the West with something close to sporting admiration for the men who had beaten him. According to that same account, Rundstedt privately conceded that the Americans had simply outshot the Germans in the final campaigns, chasing his forces from the Rhine at Remagen all the way into the Ruhr, and he seemed to regard his own surrender as the honest conclusion of a contest he had lost fairly. Patton's own path to that farmhouse in Weilheim had been just as eventful, if considerably shorter. He had commanded American armor in North Africa and Sicily before taking charge of the Third Army for the breakout across France in the summer of 1944, a campaign so fast-moving that it strained his own supply lines as much as it strained the retreating Germans. He had wanted, badly, to drive straight for Berlin, and had argued forcefully with Eisenhower that a concentrated spearhead attack could end the war months earlier than the broad, cautious advance that was ultimately chosen. That argument was overruled, a decision that still frustrated Patton in the war's final weeks, and it is worth remembering that he met the news of Rundstedt's capture as a man denied the glory of the war's final act, forced instead to watch other armies close in on the German capital, while his own advanced through Bavaria and Czechoslovakia. Some who have studied Patton's temperament in this period have suggested that this frustration may have sharpened his need to perform the role of the magnanimous victor wherever the opportunity arose, turning a routine prisoner processing into a stage for the kind of old-world gesture that suited his self-image far better than paperwork ever could. That sentiment was not unique to Rundstedt. Other German commanders who faced Patton across the battlefield left remarkably consistent testimony after the war. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's own tank doctrine, described Patton as strikingly quick in his movements and instinctively understood the tempo that armored warfare demanded. Rommel, writing while recovering from wounds in France, judged Patton the outstanding tactical practitioner of mobile warfare on the Allied side. And Rundstedt himself, in an interview given to the American Forces newspaper Stars and Stripes shortly after his capture, offered a verdict so blunt it needed no elaboration. Of all the Allied generals, Patton was simply the best. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. None of this proves the salute took place exactly as the story is usually told, and it is worth pausing on why that matters. Compare it for a moment with a story about Patton for which there is genuinely strong documentation. His encounters with captured SS officers, several of whom reportedly expected the same military courtesies as regular army generals and were instead met with open contempt, on one occasion allegedly refused so much as a formal address. The distinction Patton drew between Wehrmacht professionals and SS ideologues shows up again and again in the testimony of the men who served under him, which lends the Rundstedt anecdote a certain plausibility even without a signed witness statement to confirm the exact gesture. It fits the pattern of a man who publicly performed a code of honor even in the last, ugliest weeks of a war that had made a mockery of chivalry on an industrial scale. There is also a useful comparison to be drawn with how German commanders themselves talked about the Allied side after the war. Albert Kesselring, who had faced British and American forces in Italy and later succeeded Rundstedt as commander in the West, went so far as to compare Patton's feel for armored warfare directly with that of Rommel, suggesting both men possessed a kind of instinctive understanding of tank movement that other commanders lacked. Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations staff, called Patton the American equivalent of Guderian, bold, prone to large-scale maneuver, and willing to take the kind of risks that produced decisive results. Even Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded the retreating Afrika Korps after El Alamein, admitted that Patton was not the sort of opponent who would allow a beaten army to slip away quietly. None of these were men with any reason to flatter an American general once the war was over, and their own careers and reputations were, in many cases, already in ruins. That such a consistent picture of grudging respect emerges independently from several different German officers lends real weight to the idea that Patton had, in fact, earned a distinctive reputation among his opposite numbers, one built on genuine professional recognition rather than post-war diplomacy. The comparison with how other Allied commanders handled their opposite numbers is instructive too. Bernard Montgomery, whom German generals privately regarded as the more cautious strategist of the two, tended to treat defeated enemy commanders with a correct but distant formality, more administrator than fellow soldier. American commanders further down the chain, dealing with the sheer administrative scale of processing surrendering German army groups, rarely had the luxury of anything beyond brisk efficiency. Patton's theatrical instinct for gesture, the same instinct that produced his famous ivory-handled pistols and his speeches to the troops, made him almost uniquely likely to turn a routine prisoner handover into a moment loaded with symbolic weight, which is precisely why the story has proven so durable even in the absence of a definitive primary source. Whether it happened in Weilheim in the first days of May, or was embellished later by men retelling a war they had lived through, it captures something true about how Patton wanted to be seen and, by several credible accounts, how he actually behaved towards professional soldiers he respected. The wider legacy of that encounter, real or partly mythologized, is really a legacy about how the Western Allies chose to remember the war they had just won. Rundstedt was never put on trial. Despite being placed on lists of suspected war criminals, and despite his role in orders that enabled atrocities on the Eastern Front, evidentiary difficulties and the onset of Cold War politics meant he was released from custody in 1948 without facing the tribunal that condemned so many of his colleagues. He lived quietly in Hanover until his death in 1953, giving interviews to military historians along the way, a fate almost unimaginable for a man of his rank when set against the fates of others tried at Nuremberg. Patton, for his part, would be dead within 8 months of the war's end, killed in a car accident in December 1945, his own post-war reputation cemented as much by his flair for the dramatic gesture as by his undeniable talent on the battlefield. What the story of the salute ultimately preserves, whatever its exact factual foundation, is a glimpse of an idea that the Second World War was already busy destroying, that soldiering was a shared profession with its own honor code, one that could survive even between men whose nations had spent years trying to kill one another. It is an uncomfortable idea in hindsight, given everything historians now know about the regime Rundstedt served and the orders he signed, and modern audiences are right to view it with more skepticism than the veterans who first told it. But it is also a useful reminder of how the men who actually fought that war often understood it in far more complicated terms than the clean moral narratives that came afterwards. Return for a moment to that farmhouse in Weilheim, the rain still falling, the old field marshal still seated at his table with his hands folded. Within days, he would be flown to Britain for further interrogation, his active part in the war finished for good. Within weeks, the war in Europe itself would be over entirely. And within that narrow window, whether in a single dramatic gesture or in 100 smaller moments of grudging professional respect, two soldiers who had spent years trying to destroy each other's armies found themselves, however briefly and however uneasily, speaking the same old-fashioned language of rank and honor. It is a small scene, and perhaps not even an entirely accurate one, set against the vast horror of the war that produced it. But it survives in the retelling because it captures something the official record cannot. Not the defeat of Nazi Germany in numbers and territory, but the strange, human moment when the war's last professional soldiers looked at each other and, if only for a second, saw a fellow officer rather than an enemy. That is why the story of Patton and Rundstedt is still told today, 80 years on, whether it happened exactly as the legend says or not.